Hey, Carl Franklin here. Listening back to this show was helpful to me. Some passing comments from Richard that I'll never forget are, the liver's job is to keep the brain fed, and the liver requires insulin to convert glucose into glycogen. I also learned what the words anabolic and catabolic mean. Anabolic means building up, and catabolic means breaking down. Of course, this is where we introduce the fact that insulin is as close as we get to a metabolic switch. When insulin is high, glucose is stored as fatty acids in fat cells. When insulin is low, fatty acids from fat cells can be used as fuel. So higher insulin equals weight gain, lower insulin equals weight loss. Insulin resistance is the result of chronic high insulin. Cells are no longer listening to the message of insulin. They become deaf to it. So insulin becomes less effective at clearing glucose from the blood, and also glucose becomes less effective as a fuel. So insulin resistance is really starving. It's a vicious cycle. You're hungry, so you eat carbs. That increases your insulin resistance, which makes your body less effective at utilizing the food energy, and so you eat more. And that is why you can eat an entire pizza, have a full belly, and still want to eat more. We also talked about salt. When we eat a lot of carbs, the kidneys reabsorb that salt and therefore hypertension. When you cut carbs and go into ketosis, the kidneys flush salt. So therefore, people in ketosis need to take more salt than they're used to. This episode is also where Richard introduces his favorite study, in which a dog was accidentally injected with too much insulin in only one half of its body, and that side of the dog became atherosclerotic. Insulin causes arterial inflammation. This may be why type 2 diabetics often have heart conditions. Richard also introduced Joseph Kraft in this episode. Wow, he really brain dumped here. There's so much good information in the third episode of Two Keto Dudes. Now you know why he's my guru. So let's listen to this Two Keto Dudes classic episode number 3, Insulin, from February 2016. Hi, I'm Carl Franklin. I live in Connecticut in the United States, and I've just started a ketogenic diet to take control of my metabolism.
G'day, I'm Richard Morris in Canberra, Australia. I've been on a ketogenic diet now since April of 2014. When I started, I was very sick with complications from type 2 diabetes. Within 6 months of starting a ketogenic diet, all my biomarkers of disease had disappeared.
I also have type 2 diabetes, and we're going to share the progress of my journey into ketosis and Richard's experience thriving for years on ketosis. And hopefully that might help a few people who are curious about this kind of dietary hacking.
We're not doctors, so we're not going to give anyone any medical advice, but we are keen to share our own experiences. We're actually both software developers, so we're not afraid of a little technical detail, But we've done a bit of research into our own deranged metabolisms and the science behind those, and we hope to share some of that research, and where possible, we intend to put links in the show notes to cite the research supporting any claims that we make.
Right. You'll probably work out pretty quickly that we're both foodies. We love to eat. We're also going to share some of the great food that we can eat on this diet. And every episode, we both share a recipe for an essential keto meal that we eat regularly. So let's get going with podcast number 3, The Insulin Show. Well, first of all, Richard, do we have any errata from, any things that we want to correct about the last show?
Sure, Carl. So I listened to the episode. In fact, I went for a bike ride today, a 50k bike ride around the lake in the middle of Canberra today, listening to us speak as part of my preparation for tonight. And I misspoke twice. I mentioned that Robert Lustig said that fructose causes insulin sensitivity. But of course, I intended to say that he said that fructose causes the insulin resistance that ultimately makes glucose an acute poison.
Little difference there.
Yeah, a slight difference, yeah. Also, I mentioned that the ancient Greeks discovered that diabetes is related to sugar by tasting it. Well, actually, that's not entirely true.
Oh.
Yeah, it was an Englishman named Thomas Willis who in 1674 discovered that urine of a diabetic patient was wonderfully sweet as if imbued by honey.
Invite the neighbors, honey. We're having a drink party.
Exactly. Now, the ancient Greeks were the ones who noticed that people who had diabetes had insatiable thirst and peed all the time. So the name diabetes is actually Greek for siphon. So they have quite a sense of humor, these Greeks.
That's awesome. Well, before we get started with insulin, let's check in. How are you doing? I remember you were on a plateau like me.
Yeah, I've actually been on a plateau for almost 18 months now. I go up and down a little bit, but for the most part, for the first 5-6 months, I was on a massive weight loss, and then all of a sudden I plateaued. But in that time that I plateaued, a lot of my metabolic markers got better. So my HbA1c dropped from 5.5% down to 5.2%. My HDL rate went up, and my triglycerides went down. So there were a lot of things that were happening. Also, I lost about 8 inches off around my belly. So while I wasn't really putting on or losing weight, my body was becoming much more healthy.
Well, perhaps you were gaining muscle mass, which happens, right?
That's right, yeah. And it could be a net zero effect. But
right.
So I tried fasting last weekend, and I had a wonderful success with that.
Right.
So I'm actually going to integrate fasting, an extended fast of 2 or 3 days into probably every month or every 2 months. Because the results for my blood sugar were spectacular.
Well, I got to tell you, I was on a plateau and we did a show last week, and the next day I broke the plateau, and I did it by, I think what did it, and of course I don't know because I'm not doing any scientific studies or anything, but I started walking. I have a treadmill desk, and 3 days out of the week, this past week, I walked an hour each day.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, and it's great just because I set up a laptop and I watch, old reruns of Star Trek and things that I like. And I can watch 1.5 episodes before an hour goes up, and it just flies by. It's great.
Yeah. So do you actually feel like exercise, or are you pushing yourself to do it?
No, I felt great, and I felt like I needed to. Like I said before, I had this urge. My body was telling me, you need to get up and move.
Yeah.
And, I'm so used to ignoring what my body tells me because most of my life it's been a bitch,
Yeah. Unreliable.
So, but now, I feel so good that, I can pick up on the things that I'm feeling physically. And, those are signals that you need to do something different.
Yeah.
And so in terms of, weight loss and everything, I've been going great this is my 4th week, right? End of my 4th week.
Sure. Yeah.
And you're going to see the recipe that I'm going to share today is a low-carb waffle.
Oh, nice.
And I had that during the week, and it was fine and great. And then come yesterday, so my wife and I are out watching a show, and we found a good place that did low-carb, high-fat dinner for us, and that was great.
Nice.
But breakfast the next day was at a hotel. I got blue crab eggs Benedict with a side of bacon.
Oh, nice.
I didn't get any bread or anything. So that came on a bed of blue crab. And I didn't know this, but blue crab is really kind of sweet.
Yeah.
So after taking a couple bites, I was like, I don't want to bite that anymore. And even the hollandaise seemed like it wasn't full fat. Like it seemed like, and the bacon was so crisp that it was not greasy or anything. And I'm like, I wonder if I'm eating enough fat.
Yeah.
But that got me through the day. And I add a little cream to my coffee and everything. But then around 3:00 yesterday, I was like, I got to make those waffles again. And I think I can do this.
Yeah.
And I changed something in the mix. I used a maltitol-based pancake syrup versus a Splenda-based pancake syrup. The maltitol is much sweeter, and I was missing that kind of sweetness. And guess what?
What?
Blew me out. It blew me out of ketosis.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I just discovered that I have a sensitivity to maltitol. that I didn't realize.
It's unfortunate because it's in a lot of the Atkins bars and a lot of other things. They put maltitol in, and it's a slower absorbing sugar, but it'll turn into glucose fairly quickly. So
what happened was I immediately, and I'm talking a half an hour afterwards, I immediately felt like I'd just eaten a Twinkie, you know?
Oh no.
Yeah. And that whole carb thing came back and my muscles felt strained, and I knew I was kicked out.
Yeah.
And, this morning, although the P strip said that I was in moderate ketosis, they do kind of lie. A blood test last night, or a breath test.
Right.
Ketone test was negative last night. So this morning I got right back on the wagon.
That's
and,
it. You just got to get right back on the horse. Yep.
Yeah. I had my bulletproof coffee, and after about a half an hour, the feelings started to subside. That's my experience.
I'm actually lucky. Most of the sugar alcohols don't affect me, but maltitol is one that does. So
yeah, I got to watch it. And we're going to do a whole show on artificial sweeteners.
Yeah.
Just for anyone who's curious, the less sweet Splenda-based pancake syrup that I used was Walden Farms pancake syrup.
Okay, cool.
And it has a good maple flavor. It's just not very sweet.
Yeah.
And that had absolutely no effect on me. I had a wonderful time with it. But then I ordered this other stuff based on people's recommendations, Joseph's sugar-free maple syrup. And, let's just say that it's maltitol based, and it blew me out of ketosis.
Yeah. The other thing you could probably find is that sometimes if you've got not a great chef, you'll find that they'll get hollandaise out of a jar, and that stuff uses starches to gel the stuff.
Yeah.
It's not made on the moment. So, you might find that you probably had some sneaky starches inside the hollandaise, and the crab may have been soaked in sugar and salt too.
Yeah, it may have, but it is a naturally sweet crab.
Right. Yeah.
Blue crab is, but I didn't eat most of it. So I just had a few bites. Yeah, it was bound to happen.
Back up on the horse. Back up on
the horse. Exactly. Yeah. Well, it feels so crappy that I need to get back to this good feeling again.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of what's driving me.
Okay.
We've got a podcast to do, my friend.
Let's do a podcast. Let's talk about insulin, huh?
So just to back up a bit, what is a ketogenic diet anyway?
Well, for the keto curious, of people who have been hearing us talk about it, if you go back to chapter 1 or episode 1, you'll hear a fairly in-depth detail of it. But the essence is that you restrict your carbohydrate intake to just incidental carbs. So, if you have a little bit of spinach has a little bit of carbs in it, and that's not a bad thing. But you don't want to have things like potatoes and rice and wheat and starches and sugars.
Right. And I said before that you want to limit it to 30 grams a day. They say 50 grams a day is enough to be in ketosis, but I believe even on the Atkins induction diet, it's 20.
Yeah.
So, incidental is good. Don't count them for cripe's sake,
that's it. The other thing is that, you can subtract the fiber because you don't digest fiber. Now, if you look at a nutritional information of a food, it'll say how many carbohydrates it has, and it'll probably say how much fiber it is. And for the most part, you can subtract that.
So you get net carbs.
That's right. Yeah.
So what about protein?
You just have enough protein to maintain your muscles. So it's actually 1 gram of protein for every kilogram of lean body mass. And
now, how do you know how many kilograms of lean body mass you have, or how many pounds?
It's basically how much you would weigh when you were 20 and you were fit and you were carrying 8% body fat. There are some websites that will help you calculate that. The official way to really know is to get a DEXA scan, which is a special type of diagnostic that you can get done. But you can guesstimate the amount. For me, it's about 75 kilograms. So if I was ideal weight, carrying no fat at all, my weight would be 75 kilograms. So I based on
Isn't there a calculation that's based on your height and your weight?
The body mass index, it's actually not a very good one. We should do a whole show on me just pulling that thing to pieces, because from a medical point of view, doctors love it. But from a mathematical point of view, it makes absolutely no sense. It's totally cuckoo. So,
otherwise known as bullshit. All right. So I saw the keto calculator site out there.
Yeah.
Which is a little bit. Yeah. It's a little bit more information you have to plug in, but no. Yeah. So I'm thinking for me, about 100 grams of protein a day
Yeah, that's about where and that's not 100 grams of meat. Only a portion of the meat is actually protein. So, 300 gram steak is probably going to have about, 100 or between 100 and 150 grams of, protein in it.
So there you go. And everything else is from fat. So your strict carbs, less than 20 grams a day, enough protein to maintain your muscles, 1 gram for every kilogram of lean body mass, and everything else you eat fat. Okay. Now let's move on to insulin. So what is insulin?
Insulin regulates the transport of energy into cells in your body. It basically allows glucose to get into your cells, certain proteins to get into your cells for construction. And it also, although it doesn't allow fats to get into cells, it stops them from getting out of cells. So
interesting.
Insulin is actually a hormone that's made in the pancreas in specific cells called beta cells. The pancreas makes insulin all the time and it stores it in these beta cells. And there are 5 specific causes that will cause the pancreas to release it. One of them is the vagus nerve, and that's one of the core metabolic regulators of the body. And that will make sure that there's a basal amount of insulin, a low hum of insulin going through your body perpetually. But it goes in cycles of 3 to 6 minute cycles, on and then off, on and then off. And the purpose of that is to make sure that all of the systems that are listening for insulin aren't hearing insulin all the time and therefore tuning it out.
If you think about it, there's 2 sides to insulin, right? And this relates specifically to the 2 types of diabetes type 1 and diabetes type 2, where type 1 is not enough insulin and type 2 is too much insulin. So why do you need it in the first place? What's the upside? What is the positive effect of insulin?
The primary role of insulin is to keep glucose from going too high. We spoke last week during the sugar show about all of the horrible things that happen when sugar is too high. And the body fights to try and keep it within a range, an ideal range. And the way that it fights to keep sugar down is by secreting more insulin. And so your pancreas will secrete more insulin if your sugar starts to go high, you go eat a carby meal, your pancreas will secrete more and more insulin. Now, it used to be people would get type 1 diabetes when they were young, in their early teens. And it's an autoimmune disease where the beta cells of the pancreas are actually killed off by the person's own immune system. They just had a bad cold one day. Their immune system's gone running around the body looking for things that look like that particular virus. And they find the beta cell and they say, it looks like it, we're going to take that out. So it's a very sad thing that happens to people. And they can't make any insulin at all. And the problem with them not being able to make insulin is now glucose goes very high because there's nothing to stop it. And they, because they can't make any insulin at all, they can't get any of that glucose into their cells. So then there's an entire cascade of horrible effects that happen.
So you do need, obviously you need energy to get into cells, and this insulin is what regulates how that happens and what things get to go in for energy. And glucose is the primary fuel for somebody who's eating, a balanced, quote unquote, balanced diet, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And so that is good. And it also, what does it do to glycogen, which is your people think of as the water weight, the glycogen that is your store of, like for me, I broke through, I'm not in ketosis anymore. I imagine my glycogen has been repleted.
That's right. And so we spoke last week about the liver's ability and the muscle cells' ability to store a little bit of glucose. They store about a day's worth of supply for the body.
And that's in every cell?
That's in all of your skeletal cells, and in the liver itself has a very large reservoir for, the liver's job is to keep the brain fed. So it stores glycogen in the liver, and the liver requires insulin to be able to get that glucose in to be able to convert it into glycogen. So one of the things that happens with type 2 diabetics, so we mentioned last week, type 2 diabetics naturally make 3 times the amount of glucose.
Yeah.
The diabetics also become insulin resistant, and part of that is that, well, I mentioned last week there's a lot of different insults that can happen, and any one of these things can make somebody type 2 diabetic, and all of them happening at the same time will definitely make you type 2 diabetic. But it's things like genetics and how much sugar you eat, how much carbohydrates you eat. And because you eat glucose, you must make insulin. And because you eat a lot of glucose all the time, you're making a lot of insulin all the time. Now, the cells that are responding to that message, if they hear insulin all the time, they're going to get bored with it because they're going to dial it out, right? Mm-hmm. So what happens is the cells of the liver start to dial out the ability to listen to insulin. And so a type 2 diabetic doesn't become very good at storing glycogen. They lose the ability for the muscle cells to get glucose in because the muscle cells become insulin resistant, and the cells of the pancreas itself become insulin resistant, or insulin toxicity causes them to be unable to efficiently produce insulin.
So it sounds like when insulin is present, there's more glycogen synthesis?
Yeah, so insulin is required to synthesize glycogen in the liver.
I see. All right. And then also amino acids building into proteins. This happens with insulin as well. And that's where the term anabolic comes from, right?
Right.
Like I've heard anabolic steroids. That's really the only time I hear that word. But what does anabolic mean?
Anabolic means building up. So you have two processes. You have a catabolic process breaking down. You have an anabolic process building up. And so insulin is required for some of these amino acids to get into cells to build up the cell to do something with it. So
you do need some insulin for just natural metabolic function.
Yes, that's right.
So what's the downside of insulin?
Okay, so there's a couple of things. One of the things that insulin does is it locks fat into fat cells. And it does this through a mechanism of inhibiting a hormone-sensitive lipase, an enzyme called hormone-sensitive lipase, which is used by fat cells to mobilize fat, so to get it out and for the rest of the body to work on it. The reason the body does this is when you eat a lot of glucose, your body produces insulin. It's doing that to try and get this glucose level down, and it wants to do a couple of things. It wants to use as much glucose as it can. It wants to convert as much of it into fat, and it doesn't want to use any alternate sources of energy. So it wants to push all of the fat into the fat cells so that everybody's using glucose. Let's everybody use it. We'll get that glucose level down.
So that's why we say that eating fat doesn't make you fat. High levels of insulin is what actually causes weight gain.
Yeah, that's right.
Because it's not allowing the fat in your cells to be burned as fuel.
Yeah, it's not allowing the fat to get out of the fat cells and into your cells to be burned. Now, here's the thing. If your cells are also insulin resistant, that is, they're no longer listening to the message of insulin. Not only can they not get fat in to burn, they can't get glucose in to burn. So at a cellular level, somebody with type 2 diabetes is starving at a cellular level. Yeah. They don't have energy getting into their cells.
And getting heavier at the same time. That's why you're tired all the time after a carby meal.
The two most likely strategies when your cells are starving is, one, find more food, and two, consume as little energy doing that as you possibly can. Now, this is literally gluttony and sloth.
Yeah, that's right.
We look at these as moral things, but these are really just biochemical results of the fundamental biochemistry of what happens to somebody who's insulin resistant.
And this is why people say, just eat less and exercise more. What's the matter with you?
Yeah.
You're lazy.
Yeah, we should do an entire podcast on the myth of self-control.
Right. It's about portion control. I hear that all the time,
I hear that
right?
a lot as well. We think of diet and exercise as being part of our body's metabolism, but these are really external events that our body's metabolism reacts to. Like, for example, today I went for a 50K bike ride, and my body's reacting by slowing down my metabolism a bit, making me a little bit more hungry, and doing these things to fight the weight loss. Well, that's how the body reacts, because these things are all external behaviors.
All right. So let's talk about salt and in the kidneys with higher levels of insulin.
Your kidneys are all the time extracting minerals out of your blood. But if you have high levels of insulin, your kidneys reabsorb the sodium that they've filtered out. They reabsorb it and put it back into the blood. This is one of the reasons why people who are type 2 diabetic and eating a lot of carbohydrates have a problem with hypertension. It's one of the reasons why high blood pressure is part of the complexus that's called metabolic syndrome.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I know I've seen many people saying they use light salt, that they don't try to cut salt and fat out of their diet, and they're doing essentially the opposite of what they should be doing.
Yeah, well,
isn't it?
If you're eating a lot of carbohydrates, then you don't want to eat a lot of salt because you're reabsorbing it in the kidneys. It's not going through you like it normally would.
The thing that I come back to again and again, the more I look at this science, and I'm sure you've had this idea many, many times, is that people are always looking for a single thing, like just cut this out or just add this or just do that and everything will be fine. But it's really about how all of these things work together. It's a more holistic view, that leads us to this ketogenic diet. It's not just that you're eating fat, it's that you're not eating carbohydrates.
Yes, it's true.
And you can't do one without the other.
No.
If you eat a high fat, high carbohydrate diet, that's a disaster waiting to happen.
Absolutely, yes.
Even if you eat a low fat, high carbohydrate diet, right? I mean, it's all these things that work together. You can't just do one part of it. You can't just eat, fatty omelets, for breakfast and then have fruit.
No, that's right.
Sugary fruit. You can't do that. You have to be all in.
Absolutely. The goal really of a low carbohydrate diet is to be able to fully feed the body without raising insulin too high. So there's a couple of other really dangerous effects of insulin. One of them is that it can cause arterial inflammation. That we actually discovered this by accident. There was a researcher who was working with insulin in dogs, and he had an insulin line into a dog's femoral artery. And he actually put too much insulin in. And within a couple of days, the dog had become entirely sclerotic in that artery. So it basically hardened up and become atherosclerosis. It literally cardiovascular disease on only one side of the dog's body, the side that the insulin was going into. So they went back and did a full test with a number of dogs to work out how many days it took for this to happen. People who are type 2 diabetic, we mentioned before, they have high insulin. They have high insulin all the time. And the more that they have high insulin, the more the rest of the body ignores it, the more the pancreas has got to produce more insulin to try and get the message through.
Yeah.
It's a vicious cycle. Now, you have that high insulin in your veins and arteries and capillaries. You have that for long enough. You're going to get arterial inflammation. You're going to get plaques forming. And this may be why people with type 2 diabetes have got a fourfold increase in cardiovascular disease.
Too much insulin, very dangerous.
Yes.
And not only will it keep you fat, but it's just all these negative health benefits as well. But you do need some.
Yeah.
This matter of ketosis, which is really the magic sauce for the ketogenic diet, isn't it? This, as we said before, invokes fear in the hearts of many hard-won professionals who only see high ketone levels and ketoacidosis in type 1 diabetics.
Right.
Which is a totally different metabolic problem altogether.
Yeah, that's right.
Nutritional ketosis is having enough ketones in your blood to feed your brain, but not too many so that your blood is acidic.
The fact that we as type 2 diabetics or anybody who's not type 1 diabetic, any of us who can make a little bit of insulin, that's sufficient to stop us getting into levels of diabetic ketoacidosis. So that's actually the critical thing that does it. We often think of our brain running everything in our body, but in fact, most of the behaviors of our body are run by a counterbalancing of various hormones working in conjunction with each other.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons why the insulin is sometimes called the quarterback of hormones is the fact that it drives a lot of our energy behavior. So, for example, I mentioned before that insulin stops fat from getting out of fat cells. If you step back a bit and look at it from a holistic point of view, insulin is controlling whether you're going to store energy or you're going to burn energy. If you have low insulin, you're going to burn more energy. You're going to draw down on your fat reserves. If you have high insulin, you're going to suck up energy into your fat reserves for later on.
Yeah.
And the problem, of course, is with the modern diet. We have a lot of carbohydrates in our diet. That keeps our insulin up for a long time. And for those of us who have a problem with producing too much of it anyway, that makes it even worse for us. And because our insulin is so high for so long, it means that we're putting on weight, more and more weight. So, the thing about the ketogenic diet is it takes the foot off the accelerator for insulin. And so all of a sudden our body is no longer forced unnaturally to store energy. The body's able to get to a safer position. So in my case, in 5 to 6 months, my body lost a lot of weight till I went from a BMI of 45 to a BMI of 29. And that's a fairly significant drop. And then I just plateaued there for, as I say, 18 months.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, my body was becoming healthier and healthier.
Let's talk about some of the research behind insulin resistance and patterns. Dr. Gerald Raven, you cite here, was he one of the pioneers in figuring out this whole metabolic syndrome?
He actually invented the term metabolic syndrome. It used to be called Syndrome X, and he identified that insulin resistance as the core of a lot of this metabolic syndrome.
Yeah.
But there was actually a guy named Joseph Kraft in Chicago, I think. He's now 95 years old, and there's actually a wonderful video of him being interviewed by Ivor Cummings on YouTube, and we'll put it in the links. But he actually, 10 to 15 years before Gerald Raven came up with this concept of insulin resistance, he actually identified 5 different patterns of insulin, 1 normal one, 3 insulin diabetes in situ, which is diabetes, type 2 diabetes, and 1 which is type 1 diabetes. And he actually worked out that almost a decade before your blood sugars start to go high and your doctor says, oh, you might be getting pre-diabetes, a decade before that, he could actually see the diagnostic results in somebody's insulin assay. He could see
10 years.
10 years beforehand, he could see this person is producing too much insulin, but the pancreas is keeping up. So this person is fine. It's only 10 years later, 10 years of producing way, way too much insulin and doing all of that vascular damage. 10 years of that damage later, the pancreas starts saying, oh, I can't produce as much insulin as we need to be able to.
I'm done.
It says, I'm out of here. And that's when your blood sugars start to go up. By the time most general practitioners or primary care practitioners are looking at a blood glucose and saying, we might have to test you for diabetes, you've had it for 10 years and you've been doing all the damage for 10 years. So, that's probably the most interesting thing. But I recommend anybody who's interested in hearing an old retired 95-year-old doctor talk about something he's been working on in the privacy of his world for, 50, 60 years. It's only just becoming, people are just starting to now publicize it.
So, I want to step back a little bit and talk about my situation right now is after 4 weeks, in a plateau in the last week or the last 2 weeks, actually, and then going off of it. I think this is a fairly common pattern that people get into. They get into a low carb diet and a ketogenic diet, and, then they hit the wall and it gets frustrating, and then some cheat happens or something, and boom, you feel like crap again. I got to say, though, that the last week, I felt fully adapted. I did not feel flu-like. I didn't have any symptoms. I felt sharp.
That's awesome.
Yeah, exactly. So, and I know that in keto, once you're keto adapted like that, you can withstand the lapse that I'm having right now. You can withstand a spike in insulin that lasts for a day or two, and instead of taking a week to get back into ketosis, it'll only take a couple of days.
Yeah, that's right. 2 or 3 days, I think, is the...
But we also talked about fasting and how fasting can bring on ketosis a lot faster than... But would you, and I know you're not a doctor, but in your experience, do you think it's a good idea for somebody at my stage who has gone through that couple of weeks, been keto adapted, and then had a spike to get back into it with a fast? Or should I go slower?
I thought I'd never last a fast.
Yeah.
I thought I like my food too much. There is no way I will go kicking and screaming before I go without food. Last weekend, I started doing it I basically wagered myself that I couldn't do it. And, 63 hours later, I thought, I could keep going with this, but I think I might stop because I said I'd stop, So,
but I sense danger though if you do that for too long. Can it be dangerous? I mean, you have to keep your nutrient levels up, and you have to,
Yeah, there was a guy, there was a Scotsman who had a BMI in the 40s who walked into a hospital and said, I want to become an experiment of one. I want you to feed me nothing for as long as I can, as long as you consider me healthy. And he lasted for something like 250 days or something.
Good Lord.
Before they said, okay, well, we're going to start feeding you now because we're getting very worried about what's happening. So when you're fasting, you're drawing down on your own fat reserves. Mm-hmm. And so if you're best adapted to burn fat, then it's a natural state to be in. If you're best adapted to burn glucose, you need to first of all unwind that glucose adaptation to become better at burning fat. And that's a painful thing.
Yeah. So what I think you're saying is do a fat fast. In other words, give yourself enough nutrients to get back into ketosis. Once you're into ketosis, then maybe go for a day or two.
That's right. Now, one interesting thing about you being, you're in ketosis comfortably. You're adapted. You're burning fat.
Yeah.
You had a slight incident with some maltitol, but other than that, and maybe some blue swimmer crab, but other than that, you're doing fine. So, one of the things that you can do now is you can start to dial back on the amount of fat that you put on your plate and get it from your body instead. So eat fat to satiety. You're going to be drawing down on body fat all day.
Yeah.
If you eat more fat than you need energy, you'll be adding some body fat. And
right.
you can do that. It means you gain a little bit of weight and then you can the next day have less fat and drop a little bit of weight. But that's now that you're adapted, you have a lot more metabolic flexibility to be able to do that.
And it's like having a knob, isn't it? Because, one of the cool parts of this is that you're not hungry. Like right now, I'm still feeling the effects of the high blood sugar. Like I know that feeling. I'm very familiar with it,
Yeah.
But, I imagine after tonight, maybe tomorrow, that will subside and my hunger will subside. And that's what happens is that you can be very scientific about it.
Yeah.
So I like having that dial that you can just turn down and it's not going to affect your hunger and, your performance or mental acuity or anything.
That's right.
It'll be interesting to see what happens next week.
Yeah. No, that'll be interesting.
All right. It's time for recipes. Heard you say you're due for a little Recipes.
So would you like me to go first this time?
Yeah, you go first this time.
Well, so I did the fast last weekend.
Right.
And I didn't eat nothing. I ate a bit of green tea with mint. All you got to do is have very few calories. But because Julie wasn't fasting, when she had dinner, just to be sociable, I had something to eat at the same time. I had a couple of tablespoons of chicken stock in a mug of boiling water, and I whisked it up in a magic bullet so that it emulsified and it basically turned white. It was almost like chicken mayonnaise, but it was watery, obviously, but it was like a thicker than just water.
Now your stock, you cook it down a lot, right? I do the same thing too. So I end up with not a lot of liquid.
Yeah.
And I do what you do, which is I freeze it in ice cubes.
Yeah. I have 1.5 entire freezer drawers full of homemade stock, frozen stock as ice cubes in freezer bags. So I'm going to share a recipe for chicken stock, and this is a roast chicken stock. And I got this from Heston Blumenthal, and I'll include a link to my blog on how I came up with this. But I got this from Heston Blumenthal, who has a recipe for making chicken stock, but he uses some high carbohydrate ingredients. So what I do is I get chicken wings, and I get wings with the tips on. Sometimes they they think they're being helpful to cut the tips off, but really when you're making stock, you want all of those gnarly bits, because the gnarly bits under the pressure and heat are going to turn to gelatin. And there's nothing better than a stock that is almost solid. When you put it in the fridge and it comes out, it's chicken jello. So
now, I know about making stock, and the first thing I know is you brown the bones.
Yes, that's right.
So, you don't brown the bones, but do you brown the wings? Do you, saute them until they get crispy and black?
I do, and I have a special trick I got from Heston. He uses skim milk powder, and he sprinkles a little bit of skim milk powder over the chicken wings, and then he roasts them in the oven. And
you can use baking soda too.
You can? Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah,
that's awesome.
Baking soda will crisp up a chicken. I know that in a recipe where you want a crispy skin anyway, you use baking soda to dry it out, and then you put it in the fridge overnight. And then in the morning, you got all that crispy skin. You can cook it.
So I use full cream powdered milk, and so it's going to be less carbs. The thing is, if you get light milk, you get low fat anything is going to have more carbohydrates in it. That's the quid pro quo. So I sprinkle a little bit of full cream milk powder over the top, and I only for about 18 wings, I only need about 5 grams of the stuff, so it's a very small amount. The point is that the milk powder has a chemical reaction with the skin of the chicken called the Maillard reaction. It's basically cross-linking proteins and sugars together so that it browns and it gets that, roast chicken flavor, that unique roast chicken flavor.
Nice.
Sometimes I buy entire carcasses, which is, just, they pulled all the meat off and it's all the bones and gnarly bits left over. Well, gnarly bits are perfect for stock.
In the United States, you can go into any grocery store and get a rotisserie roasted chicken that's already browned on the skin.
Yeah.
And you can make stock from those. Just put it in water.
Oh, nice.
And the meat will fall out. You can make chicken salad from the meat when it comes out, but, put it in water, simmer it for several hours, and you've got all the brown bits and the gnarly bits in there.
We get those baked chickens, or in Australia we call them chooks, baked chook at Woolies, yeah. So the specific trick for this recipe, though, is to use the wings because they have the bits that are going to turn gelatinous. And I use a pressure cooker. Yeah, one of those electric pressure cookers. The theory behind that is that if you keep the lid on and keep everything under pressure, one, it happens quicker. So it only takes me about 2 or 3 hours of pressure cooking to do what I would otherwise have to take 24 hours in a slow cooker to do.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that because the lid's on, none of the aromats can escape. Right. They've all got to go into the stock. I mean, you have a choice. If you have an open top slow cooker, you can make your kitchen smell lovely, or you can get that flavor into the stock.
So do you use the pressure cooker to brown the wings too, or do you do that like in a fry pan?
Yeah, no, I do that in the oven. I throw them into the oven for 30 minutes in the oven. So sprinkle a little bit of powdered milk over the top of them, chuck them in the oven, and then I put onions, brown off some onions in a fry pan, throw those all into a pressure cooker, chuck in a bay leaf and maybe some herbs if I want, and
garlic.
I don't use garlic in my chicken stock, although you can if you're making a chicken soup, certainly. And, it's really a matter of just, I throw a lot of end bits of vegetables in because you're just trying to extract some of the flavor out of it.
Sure.
But the majority of the flavor in this thing is going to be roast chicken, and it's delicious.
Oh, I got to try that.
Yeah. And then I just, I use a kitchen towel, or you can use cheesecloth or muslin over a strainer and just basically empty out the proceeds into a bowl, and then I freeze them into ice cube trays. If I'm fasting, I'll just put 2 of those ice cubes in the bottom of a mug of boiling water, put it in the microwave for a minute, and it's chicken stock.
And add a little butter. Because why not?
Well, because you can.
All right, let me tell you about my recipe. Yeah. This is the low carb waffle that I discovered, and it was sort of a combination of my own, high carb waffle recipe, which I'm used to making all the time, and some waffle recipes that I found online. And I'm using this stuff called Carb Quick. Okay, and Carb Quick you can get on Amazon, and it's kind of like Bisquick, but low carb.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, and it doesn't have a lot of the typical low carb flour flavors, like soy. It doesn't really have that bad flavor. It's quite nice. So the ingredients: half a cup of Carb Quick, half a cup of heavy cream, 2 tablespoons of butter melted, 2 eggs, 2 ounces of cream cheese, 1 tablespoon of sour cream, half a teaspoon of baking powder, half a teaspoon of vanilla, 1/4 teaspoon nutmeg, 1/4 teaspoon cinnamon, and 1 packet of Splenda, which is optional.
Sure.
So you separate the eggs and beat the whites until they're stiff, and use room temperature eggs.
Right.
And if you take eggs out of the fridge, just put them in a bowl of room temperature water for about 10 minutes, and then that'll be fine. Then in another bowl, you take egg yolks, sour cream, and cream cheese and beat that until smooth. Slowly add the butter, and not too fast, because especially if it's been recently melted, you want to let it cool a little bit. So then you add the Splenda, the cinnamon, the nutmeg, the baking powder, vanilla, and mix that up, and add the Carb Quick, and then slowly add the heavy cream until you get that right consistency for waffle batter. And you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
If it's too thick, it's too thick. If it's too thin, right? So once that's all mixed up, you fold in the egg whites. We do a lot of egg white folding in this show.
Yeah.
And that's an art form unto itself.
It's a necessary one because it gets air into a mixture.
Yeah. And this is the same stuff I would do with waffles, even if it wasn't carb quick or anything else. It's just that you have more fat and you have less powder, right?
Sure.
So you want to cook this in a waffle iron. And I found that like 50% heat was pretty good. Although the ones that I made this weekend, it was interesting. I used a higher heat level and they sort of stuck to the sides. And I don't know if I got the ratios wrong or whatever, but I had to peel the waffle off, the outside got brown before the inside cooked. So now I'm thinking you want to put it on a lower setting and cook it longer.
Yeah, you don't use any sprays or anything like that because you got a lot of butter and everything.
Got a lot of fat.
Mix.
Yeah. That makes about 3 waffles. If the waffle iron isn't working for you, they make great pancakes as well. And each waffle has about 1 to 2 grams of carbs.
I think I'm gonna have to get me a waffle iron. There's no doubt about it. That sounds awesome.
And like I said about the pancake syrup before, the Walden Farm syrup is less sweet, but it, like in me anyway, Splenda doesn't give me that insulin response. However, that maltitol syrup, that Joseph's, wow.
Yeah.
That was, that's what did me in. So I don't know.
It's good to know.
Yeah, I think you should do experiments yourself with maltitol.
Yeah.
And use a glucose meter and see how it affects you.
We're all snowflakes. We're all unique. So, for
Right.
a lot of these things, we're all, as Professor Noakes says, we're all an experiment of one. And we've got to find out what is unique about us and how we react to the food that we eat.
Richard, it's been a pleasure. I always enjoy hearing your comments and your science. It's great.
No worries, Carl. Thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing this when I'm riding my bike again.
Yeah. And we'll see you next week on Two Keto Dudes.